Hi everyone, welcome to Biogeography Week 5. I hope your week is going pretty well. This week and next week are going to be relatively short compared to the other week's lectures. I want to break things up and slow things down a little bit, maybe give you a chance to catch up with some of the longer lectures and some of the more complex topics. Okay, so this lecture is going to be short, and the next week's lecture is going to be short as well. So let's get started. First, let's review the questions from week 3, or the question of the week from week 3, and where I asked what is, or for you all to define, natural selection. And a lot of you, or all of you, gave really good answers. And as with the first question about evolution, the answers were mostly correct, but there were a few spots that I think we need to just make sure that we're all understanding the definition of natural selection and what it says and what it doesn't say. So some common themes that I observed from the questions: most of you mentioned natural selection is organisms adapting to the environment, surviving better, weeding out the gene pool. Okay, so those are some important components of natural selection, and certainly things that you all understand and that are important to understand. But I wanted to make sure that we remember a couple of things about natural selection and what that process is. So remember that natural selection is a two-sided coin. A lot of you all talked about the adaptations that organisms had or might have that would help them survive better, and that certainly is a part of natural selection. But natural selection is a two-sided coin, and so there are organisms that are not as well adapted to an environment, and because of those maladaptations, or those less advantageous adaptations, they end up having lower survival and lower reproductive rates. And that's still part of natural selection, right? It's a sorting process in which some members of a population do better than others, resulting in those more beneficial traits being passed on. But the less beneficial traits not being passed on as frequently, or at a high frequency, is also part of natural selection. Okay, so we don't want to just focus on those organisms or those members of the population that are better adapted, but the less adapted ones are also part of that process. Another point to keep in mind is that natural selection isn't attempting to create any particular species, right? The environmental factors that members of a population are subject to that result in greater frequencies of particular traits, that's not the purpose of natural selection. And the reason why that is because the conditions with which a population is experiencing the sorting process change. Okay, so remember I said that a set of traits that might be adaptive in one particular context may not be adaptive or as adaptive in a different context. Okay, so natural selection isn't trying to create the best species or the fastest species or the strongest species or what have you. It's simply a sorting process that members of the population have to go through. All right, and the last thing to keep in mind is that natural selection is just one mechanism of evolution. I think you all did a pretty good job of keeping that distinct and remembering that natural selection, along with mutation and along with genetic drift, are different components of evolution, and not natural selection is not the totality of evolution. Okay, so good job with that question of the week. And so I want to keep talking about evolution, keep talking about the process in which organisms, populations, and species change by talking about speciation and extinction. All right, so this week we're just going to talk about speciation. We'll finish that up next week and then talk more in depth about extinction. Okay, so what we're talking about when we're moving from our previous discussions of evolution, now we're talking about macroevolution. So we're talking about the formation of new species, right? So these are evolutionarily novel or new organisms, things that have not existed before, but certainly have recent ancestors with which they come from, right? And so microevolution, which is what we've been talking about, not in too much detail the past couple of weeks, is we're talking about changes in a gene pool over time. Okay. And so that's, talking about mutations, genetic drift, and those sorts of things. We're really talking at a micro level. But now we're going to be talking about how do these micro evolutionary changes result in different whole species, different whole organisms that haven't existed before. And so in my opinion, this is just my opinion, microevolution is pretty cool, but macroevolution is really cool. And so when we're talking about macroevolution, we're talking about things like this, like the tree of life, ways in which different organisms are organized. And looking at this phylogenetic tree, this schematic of the relatedness of different species, we can see that there are whole organism classes that belong in different areas based on a lot of different factors. And so one of the ways that human beings, and again, remembering that the things that you're learning in this class come from a particular culture, a particular group of human beings' way of thinking of things, is that we tend to define things as a species, right? If a zebra is much more different than a beetle, and so we say they're two different species, okay? But there are some issues with this type of classification, and that has to do with what I asked you for the question of the week last week, is what is a species? And some of you have, already provided definitions for that. Make sure you get your question of the week in. But it's a difficult concept to define, I think. So I'm going to be really interested to see what the answers are for this question. But there are many different definitions of what a species is. And the reason why is because each individual definition doesn't encompass, doesn't put boundaries around what a species is that don't have exceptions to it. And we're going to talk about exceptions in a bit, right? So there's many useful concepts of what a species is, okay? One definition that exists is a group of organisms that maintains its isolation from other species through space and time, right? Okay. And, but there are some terms in here that are a little bit difficult to put boundaries around, right? And so, a group of organisms, that's fairly straightforward, that maintains isolation. All right. So isolation can mean a lot of different things. It can mean spatial isolation, right? So groups of organisms that are in different geographical places. Or it could mean that they are reproductively isolated, meaning that groups of organisms may live in the same geography, but they don't mate. Temporal isolation, right? Homo sapiens were not around during the dinosaurs. And so human beings are temporally isolated from the whole group of organisms called dinosaurs. And so we'll talk about in a little bit just the ways in which these definitions kind of have fuzzy boundaries, have squishy boundaries, as some people say, right? And another definition is a group of organisms with a unique evolutionary fate. And that's not all that scientific a term, evolutionary fate. But what it's trying to say is that there are different trajectories based on the traits that a population or a group of organisms have that are likely going to lead it down a particular path versus other organisms. For example, the evolutionary fate of the tiger, the Bengal tiger, is a very different evolutionary fate for the blue whale. And that has to do with the fact that they live in very different environments, right? And also that neither could survive in the other's environment. You put tigers in the middle of an ocean, they're not going to last that long. You put blue whales in, the Siberian tundra, they're not going to last very long. And so they have a unique evolutionary fate, right? Their species is going to play out in a different environment with a different outcome, okay? So let's talk about some of the different species concepts and the ways in which those species concepts have those squishy boundaries where there are exceptions to the rule. And one of those species concepts is called the morphological species concept. And that species concept essentially says that organisms that look different, that look phenotypically different, organisms that have different physical traits, are different species. Okay, and so that's pretty easy to think of examples of this, and I think that most people, most human beings, use this species concept when they're trying to identify organisms, right? A dog looks very different from any dog looks very different from any bird. An earthworm looks very different from a scorpion. Lots and lots and lots of examples that we can think of species that look different. But there's a problem, and some of you might already be thinking about this, is that what do you do with species that look very similar to each other, right? And here's a picture, take a minute to let your eyes adjust, of two frogs, okay? And they look very similar. They look almost identical. It's actually very difficult to tell them apart. And for a long time, human beings thought they were the same species. But it turns out that the two frogs in this picture are actually two different species. And one of the reasons why they're classified as two different species is because that if you try to mate these two frogs together, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't work for several reasons. One, they have different mating calls, in which the females of one species are only able to hear the call of males in their same species. You can listen to the calls of these two frogs and hear them and hear that they are very different. But another more interesting, or at least I think is more interesting difference, is that these two frog species have a different number set of chromosomes. Okay, and so human beings, like a lot of organisms, are diploid organisms, meaning that they have two sets of chromosomes. So we have 23, human beings have 23 chromosomes. If you've ever heard of the DNA company 23andMe, that 23 comes from the number of chromosomes that we have, number of chromosomes pairs that we have as a species. And one of these species of frogs also is diploid. It has two sets of chromosomes. The other species has 4 sets of chromosomes, tetraploid. So instead of having 2 copies of every chromosome in their body, that frog species has 4 copies, 4 different copies of the same chromosome. And so even if you were going to try to introduce the sperm of one species to the egg of another species, it wouldn't work because there simply isn't enough pairs of chromosomes for the other. Okay, and so these are 2 different species of frogs, but they look identical. It's very difficult to tell them apart. One is the gray tree frog, and the other is the Cope's gray tree frog. Even their names are very similar and reflect the fact that for a long time human beings thought they were the same species. These 2 frog species live in West Virginia and many parts of the eastern part of the United States, all the way out past the Mississippi and into parts of the Midwest, and you can hear them during the spring. I actually studied these frogs for an internship that I did when I was an undergrad. They're really cute, okay? But this is an example of where the morphological species concept isn't able to tell the difference between the species. And this is another reason why it's difficult to have one species concept that fits all examples of differences of species, okay? So generally, morphological species concept is pretty useful, but the more similar 2 different species look, the more difficult it becomes to use this species concept, okay? Another species concept is the biological species concept, right? So groups and populations that interbreed are considered species, or are considered one species, and those that don't interbreed are considered different species. So the populations must remain reproductively isolated from other groups, such that they have a unique evolutionary fate. But there's a limitation to this. And some of you might be thinking of a limitation, but one of those comes in the fossil record. So here is a picture of a raptor dinosaur. There are many different dinosaurs that belong in this species. You can see it has the sickle claw, like was described in Jurassic Park and other science fiction novels. And this is actually a artist's rendition of a velociraptor. The velociraptors in Jurassic Park, I'm sorry to say, don't exist, at least not in the fossil record that human beings have found. There is actually no raptor dinosaur that has those dimensions in the Jurassic Park films. There are some that are close, but the velociraptor is actually a much smaller dinosaur. But the author of Jurassic Park, Michael Crichton, thought that velociraptor sounded like a really awesome name, and because they couldn't use essentially a large chicken-sized dinosaur as the main, I don't want to say villain dinosaur, but the monster in the books, they created a larger version, a human-sized version of a velociraptor, but that velociraptor actually doesn't exist. At least not in the fossil record that human beings have uncovered. Okay, enough on that tangent. But there is another raptor species called the Troodon. And both of these species of dinosaurs lived around the same time, and in relatively the same area, but using the biological species concept of saying, well, if organisms don't interbreed, then they're different species. It becomes difficult to apply that species concept to the fossil record, right? Because we can't go back and see whether or not velociraptors and troodons crossbred with each other, right? We consider them to be different species based on their physiology, the shape of their bones and the size of their bones and those sorts of things. But we actually don't know whether or not these two species interbred or not. And so the biological species concept becomes really difficult because we don't know if there was any hanky-panky going on between these two, what we consider distinct species of dinosaurs. And there's really no way for us to know that until, time travel is invented, or until we are able to get some enough DNA evidence from these species of dinosaurs, which, for the most part, is impossible to get. Okay. And so that, it's another example of how one species concept doesn't always apply. And you might be thinking that there's another example where the biological species concept doesn't apply. And that can be with, organisms like horses and donkeys. All right. They are capable of interbreeding, and they produce a mule. But we'll talk more about crossbreeding between similar species in a little bit in next week's lecture. Okay, there are other species concepts that I'm just going to go over here. Recognition species concept. All right, and I mentioned with the frogs that the females of one species are only actually able to recognize or even hear the call of the males in their same species, and not the males of the similar-looking species. There are lots of examples of that in the animal kingdom, where animals are only able to recognize mates from their own species and not other species. Okay, the phylogenetic species concept is one where species are defined based on how they're put on a phylogenetic tree. So that first drawing that I showed you at the start of this lecture would be an example of the phylogenetic species concept. I put humans here and bonobos here and chimpanzees here, and therefore we have different species. And then there's the cohesion species concept, and so that's a little bit more molecular. We're dipping back into the micro environment, the micro world of biology and evolution, where we're looking at specific portions of DNA and that make up specific or exclusive genes that we see, and using that to define different species. And so the reality is that when biogeographers are identifying different species and trying to figure out who's related to whom. We use a variety of species concepts to make those distinctions. And again, this is a very particular way of classifying organisms that comes out of a particular epistemology, a particular way of thinking that's not always applicable to other species or to other or certainly for human cultures. So we think about like DNA and how DNA tests are really popular, and they're really they can tell us a fair amount of information about who we are or who our ancestors might have been. But there's a lot more that goes into who's related to who in human families, and that those tests are only as good as the data that's been collected. And so there are a lot of issues with DNA tests that are not discussed. So we just have to be open and honest about the definitions that we're using, the concepts that we're using, and make sure that we're communicating that and talking about that when we are making distinctions. Okay, so how does speciation happen? How do we get different species? And there's two particular ways that I want to focus on that are pretty consistent within the history of life on this planet. And the first type of speciation, the first type of ways in which different species are formed is called allopatric speciation. And so allopatric speciation happens through the formation of species happens through a geographic separation. And so some of you might have seen the movie The Land Before Time, which is a movie that came out, an animated movie that came out when I was a kid. And in the beginning of it, there's this big dramatic sort of volcanic event that separates some baby dinosaurs from their parent dinosaurs. And those baby dinosaurs have to go and find their parents and find the valley. And so that's sort of an example of what's called a vicariance event, a geographical separation. And in that movie, it's very dramatic. And oftentimes, vicariance events are pretty dramatic events where a population is separated from another. There's geographic isolation. And over time, those separated populations are subject to different circumstances, circumstances through natural selection or mutation or genetic drift, to the point where they become their own species. They become isolated enough, and enough time passes that they are their own species. Another example of that would be Darwin's finches, finch species that not swam but flew to the Galapagos Islands, and over time, different members of that population sort of specialized on different foodstuffs to the point now where their physiology has changed, and there's no longer interbreeding between members of the finch groups on that island. Okay, so that's allopatric speciation. Sympatric speciation is the formation of new species within the same geographic area, and I'll talk about examples of this in a little bit. Okay, and oftentimes sympatric speciation happens when there's a behavioral or niche separation. So it's more common in plants because plants don't move around, but it also happens in animal species. Okay, so an example of allopatric speciation. Here is a picture of the Grand Canyon, which many of you will recognize. And this was the Grand Canyon. The formation of the Grand Canyon was a vicariance event. This surface, this plateau, used to be filled in with rock and soil, but over time, it's been eroded away. Over time, it's been eroded away and separated species that were once one population into two. So here are 4 different species, 2 chipmunk species and 2 squirrel species. One found at the north rim of the Grand Canyon, the other found at the south rim of the Grand Canyon. And you can see here that they look very, very similar to each other. The two chipmunk species on top do, and the two squirrel species on bottom look very similar to each other. But they're actually two distinct species, and one of the ways that they are, distinguished as two different species is that they do not interbreed. Okay, so there's been enough time for their genes to change and their behavior to change such that they cannot produce viable offspring, but not enough time that has passed, not enough separation has passed, where they would look all that different. And you wouldn't expect them to look all that different because the south rim of the Grand Canyon is a very similar environment to the north rim of the Grand Canyon. All right, so their phenotype, the way that they look, is actually adaptive to that environment, but they've just been separated over many generations. Okay, and so this is an example of allopatric speciation. Okay, so sympatric speciation. Here's a map of one of the African Great Lakes, Lake Malawi, in eastern Africa. And here's a picture of a fisherman on one of the lakes. And if you've ever been to the Great Lakes in the United States, or what's now the United States and Canada, you'll recognize this picture, that if you ever stood on the shore or stood in the middle of, or not stood in the middle of the lake, but been on the lake, it looks like an ocean. It's very difficult to see the other side. Okay, but one of the interesting things about the African Great Lakes, Lake Malawi, is that it's full of different species of fish. Okay, so here is a poster of all the different species of cichlids, which are a type of fish, that are present in Lake Malawi. And in fact, you can, if you go to Petco, you can purchase some of these African cichlids as pets for your fish tank. But all of these species, they're all belong to the family of fishes called cichlids, right? And if you look at them, they look relatively similar, like they're all built off of the same model with just slight variations. And so this is an example of sympatric speciation, where there was an original founding population of cichlids, and over time, different members of that population specialized in on different foods or different environments within the lake. So some of these fish are pelagic, meaning that they swim through sort of the water column. Some of them are benthic, meaning that they spend most of their time on the bottom of the water. Some of these fishes are vegetarian, they only eat plant matter. Some are predators. Some have different coloration because they are trying to avoid other predators. So some have coloration because they're trying to attract mates. Okay, so this is an example of sympatric speciation. A population within a given environment, so there's no geographic separation, but they have behaviorally separated, or niche separated, by different specializations that they've had. Okay, another type of speciation that happens is convergent evolution. All right, and this is an example when we compare the cichlids from Lake Malawi on the right, which is from the poster that I just showed you, and one of the other African Great Lakes, Lake Tanganyika. And you can see from looking at these fishes that are in two lakes that are separated, that are geographically isolated, that these different classes of species look very similar to each other, right? And so the different members of these cichlid populations were not part of one founding population like the squirrels and the chipmunks were, but their own separate evolutionary histories, but they have adapted in very similar ways. And that's because Lake Tanganyika is very similar in an environment to Lake Malawi, and that the particular pressures for these different species to evolve the characteristics that they have been similar. But one of the ways that we that human beings are able to distinguish these species is looking at their DNA and saying like, oh wow, they look very similar, but their genes indicate that they are very distantly related, and we can see that distantly relatedness expressed in the scientific names that these species have. And you can look at the top row of species and look at the genus and species names for each of them, and you see that they're not very similar at all. Okay, and that's because they have they're very distantly related, even though they look very similar to each other. Okay, so when we talk about evolutionary change, right, how does this happen? How do we get speciation on a time scale? There's all sorts of evolutionary change that happens, and that changes within a population don't always lead to a new species. Remember, evolutionary change doesn't always result in new species. It can just result in changes in the in the allele frequencies within a population. Okay, so we tend to think of evolution as leading to like new species, but evolutionary changes can just mean variations within the same species. So one of the terms, or the term that describes this, changes that don't lead to a new species, is called anagenesis, right? Species transformation without the formation of a new species. And there's a great example of this in what many of you may have grown up living with, in canids, dogs, okay? And so all of these species, all of these breeds of dogs are the same species, and they can interbreed with each other and produce viable offspring, okay? But there's a lot of variation between them. And, if you were using the morphological species concept and you came across a Great Dane and a Chihuahua, you might think, oh boy, those two organisms must belong to two very different species, because there's no way that they could interbreed, but in fact they can. Okay, so anagenesis is the process of getting different variations of organisms within the same species, and sometimes those variations are quite dramatic. All right. The other is cladogenesis, right? So we're talking about the opposite, so the splitting of the gene pool into isolated lineages. So an example of that would be chimpanzees and Homo sapiens, right? A long time ago, millions of years ago, chimpanzees and human beings had a common ancestor. Our ancestors were part of one population, but over time we have evolved into Homo sapiens and into chimpanzees, and that was the splitting of our gene pool, of our ancestral gene pool. Okay, so again, this is another reminder that human beings didn't evolve from chimps. We didn't evolve from apes because we are apes. We didn't evolve from chimps because chimps have been evolving as long as our lineage has been evolving. Okay, but our gene pools have split. We look very different from each other, but in fact, when we look at our DNA, if you remember, our DNA is very, 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 very similar, which is one of the reasons why evolutionary biologists classify as being very closely related. Our DNA is about 99% similar. There's only a few changes that exist that have led to these dramatic differences in our species. Okay, so that's the end. That's it of this week's lecture. So what I want to ask you for the next question of the week is, we talked about speciation, and we'll keep talking about it. But of course, we have to contend with the antithesis of speciation, which is extinction. So speciation meaning new species appear, and then extinction meaning species disappearing. So this is an open-ended question, and may not have one particular answer. But the question is extinction a good thing or a bad thing? All right. So like the other questions of the week, there's no right answer. There's no particular right answer that I'm asking for, up front. But this one's even more open-ended in that I want you all to think about it and maybe write a little bit more of an explanation this week. Okay. So a reminder, there are no assignments due this week other than the question of the week. There's no readings, there's no listenings, there's no reflections. Okay. Just give you all a bit of a chance to catch up if you're a little bit behind. And then just, maybe take a little bit of a break or taking it easy for this week, because it's been It's been a long semester already, okay? Also remember to come to office hours or send me an email if you have questions or need clarification or if something's not clear. Please come to office hours. Nobody came by on Wednesday, and that's fine. I know you all are very busy and you have lots of obligations and things. But please make use of that time. Send me an email if you want to go over things. Last two things, just please continue to stay safe, follow protocol, wear your mask, wash your hands, take care of each other, check on each other, make sure, we're doing okay. I've been hearing that it's been really hard for a lot of you as students, especially if you're in quarantine, but just, being away from your families, or being isolated or being alone and not being able to go to class and socialize as much, okay? And so make sure you're checking on your friends. Make sure you've got people checking on you to just say how you doing, and, if it's just doing like a FaceTime to say hey and stuff like that, that can really mean a lot to people, okay? And so check on each other, stay safe, and we'll keep going through these strange times. All right. Talk to you all next week.